Imagine a room filled with money, not just a suitcase full, and not just a bank vault. Imagine a giant warehouse stacked from the floor all the way up to the ceiling with bricks of green cash. Now, imagine having so much money that you stop counting it. You stop trying to figure out if it is 1 million or 2 million or 10 million. It is just too much work. So, instead of counting it, you put it on a scale. You weigh the money like it is a pile of apples or a sack of flour at the grocery store. This was the life of Pablo Escobar. To understand how rich this man was, you have to look at the smallest, silliest thing on his shopping list. Every single month, Pablo spent $2,500 just on rubber bands. Think about that. Most people don't spend that much money on their rent or their car. He spent it on little loops of rubber, just to wrap around the stacks of cash so they wouldn't fall over. That is how the story of the king of cocaine begins. Not with a gun, but with a rubber band. But before he was the king of the world, he was just a boy in a town called Medellin in the country of Colombia. He didn't have any money. He didn't have any power, but he had an idea. He looked at the world and saw that people wanted things they weren't allowed to have. When he was young, the stories say he started by stealing tombstones. Imagine going into a spooky graveyard at night, taking the stone markers off the graves, sandblasting the names off, and selling them to new families. It was grim. It was dark. But it taught him a lesson. If you are willing to do the things that other people are too scared to do, you can make a lot of money. He started stealing cars. Then he started smuggling cigarettes and stereos. He was good at it. He was smart. He knew how to talk to people, and he knew how to scare them. But then he saw something new. A white powder, cocaine. In the 1970s, almost nobody knew what this stuff was. It was a secret, but Pablo saw the future. He saw that people in the United States, rich people, movie stars, bankers were going to want this white powder, and they would pay anything for it. He realized that a kilo of this powder cost very little to make in the jungles of Colombia. But he could sell it for a fortune in Miami. It was like buying a candy bar for a penny and selling it for $10. So, he built an empire. He bought airplanes. He bought islands. He hired pilots who could fly low under the radar so the police wouldn't see them. He turned the drug business into a factory line, like Ford making cars, but Pablo was making crime. But how do you become the boss of all bosses? How do you make sure nobody steals from you or tells the police on you? Pablo came up with a very simple rule. It was a rule that everyone in Colombia understood, from the poorest farmer to the most powerful judge. He called it plato o plomo. In Spanish, plato means silver, like money. Plomo means lead, like the metal inside a bullet. The choice was simple. Pablo would walk up to a police officer or a government official. He would smile that sleepy smile of his, and he would say, "I can give you a suitcase full of money. You will be rich. You can buy a big house for your mother. You can send your kids to the best schools. That is the silver." Then his eyes would go cold. "Or if you say no, I will send men to kill you. And not just you, I will kill your family. I will kill your friends." That is the lead, silver or lead. Bribe or bullet. It wasn't really a choice, was it? Everyone took the silver. And because they took the silver, Pablo owned them. He owned the police. He owned the airports. He essentially owned the country. But here is where the story gets weird. Usually, when a bad guy takes over a country, everyone hates him. But in May Day, thousands of people loved Pablo Escobar. They had pictures of him in their houses next to pictures of Jesus. They called him Don Pablo. They called him the gentleman. Why? Because Pablo wanted to be loved. He looked at the poor people in his city, people living in shacks made of garbage, people who had no food, people the government had forgotten. And Pablo opened his wallet. He built them brand new houses with real roofs and running water. He built soccer fields in the poorest neighborhoods so the kids had a place to play. He handed out turkeys at Christmas. He handed out wads of cash like he was passing out flyers. To the government and the rest of the world, he was a monster. But to the poor people of Medellin, he was Robin Hood. He was the only man who had ever helped them. This was his shield. When the police came looking for him, the people wouldn't tell. They would hide him. They would lie for him. He bought their loyalty with the money he made from selling poison to the world. And oh, the money. It became a problem, a real problem. When you are a normal business, you put your money in a bank. But when you are a drug lord, banks start asking questions. So Pablo had to hide the cash. He put it everywhere. He stuffed it inside the walls of his houses. He buried it in the farming fields. He hid it in the basements of his friends' homes. He had so much paper money sitting in dark, damp places that nature started to take it back. Every year, Pablo would lose 10% of his fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars, because rats would crawl into his hiding spots and eat the money. They would chew through the $100 bills to make nests. Mold would turn the cash green and mushy. Imagine that, losing $500 million because rats ate it, and just shrugging your shoulders because you made that much more in a week. It didn't matter. He had too much. He was listed as one of the richest men on the entire planet by Forbes magazine. A criminal, sitting on the list next to inventors and kings. But you can't buy everything. There was one thing Pablo couldn't buy, and it was the only thing he was afraid of: extradition. That is a big word, but it means something simple. It means being sent to another country, to go to jail. In Colombia, Pablo wasn't afraid of jail. He could buy his way out. He could bribe the guards. He could run his business from a cell. It was easy. But the United States wanted him. They wanted to put him in a tiny concrete box in America where nobody knew his name, where his money was worthless, and where he would never see the sun again. Pablo was terrified of this. He had a saying: better a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the United States. So, he declared war. Not a war with soldiers and tanks, but a war of terror. He wanted to scare the Colombian government so much that they would never sign the paper to send him to America. He started blowing things up. He put bombs in cars in the middle of busy cities. He blew up a commercial airplane mid-flight because he thought a politician was on board. The politician wasn't there, but more than 100 innocent people were. He was killing judges, police officers, journalists. Anyone who spoke against him got the lead. The country was bleeding. It was a nightmare. People were afraid to leave their houses, but Pablo was getting desperate. The police were closing in. The Americans were helping the Colombian government track him down. He was running out of places to hide. At one point, he tried to make a deal. It was the most arrogant, impossible deal in history. Pablo Escobar contacted the government and said, "I will make you an offer. If you change the laws so I can never be sent to the United States, I will pay off Colombia's foreign debt." He was offering to pay the debt of an entire nation, billions and billions of dollars. He was saying, "I have enough cash in my pocket to save this country's economy. Just let me go." The government said no. They couldn't make a deal with a terrorist. But the violence was getting too bad. The government was weak. Finally, they cracked. They told Pablo, "Okay, we will not send you to the United States, but you have to go to jail here. You have to surrender." Pablo smiled. He agreed. But this was Pablo Escobar. He didn't go to a normal jail. That was for common criminals. Pablo built his own jail. He found a spot on a hill overlooking his beloved city of Medellin. He called it La Catedral, the cathedral. From the outside, it had fences and guards, but inside, it was a 5-star country club. It had a soccer field where he invited the best players in the world to come and play matches with him. It had a jacuzzi. It had a bar. It had big, comfortable beds and giant televisions. And the guards, Pablo hired them. They were his men wearing prison guard uniforms. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a king in a castle that just happened to have a fence around it. While he was in this prison, trucks would drive up the hill filled with lobster, caviar, champagne, and beautiful women. He held parties. He continued to run his drug empire from the telephone in his office. He even had people brought to the prison so he could interrogate and kill them if they stole from him. He was murdering people inside his own jail. The government knew this was happening, and they were embarrassed. The world was laughing at them. The president of Colombia finally said, "Enough." He ordered the army to go to the cathedral, grab Pablo, and move him to a real military prison. But Pablo had ears everywhere. Before the army could get there, he walked out the back gate into the misty forest. He vanished into the fog. The king was on the run again. Now began the biggest manhunt in history. It wasn't just the Colombian police anymore. It was the American D. It was the CIA. It was the Navy SEALs. And it was a group called Los Pepis, a shadowy group of bad guys who hated Pablo and started killing his lawyers, his accountants, and his family's guards. Everyone was hunting him. Pablo was hiding in the jungle, moving from safe house to safe house every single night. He couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't use the phone because the Americans were listening to the signals. The most powerful man in the world was suddenly a homeless fugitive. There is a story from this time that shows just how absurd his life had become. He was hiding in a secret mountain hideout with his family. It was freezing cold. His young daughter, Manuela, was shivering. She was turning blue. They had no wood for a fire. They had no blankets. So Pablo opened a duffel bag, a desk. He pulled out stacks of $100 bills. He piled them up in the fireplace and struck a match. He burned $2 million in cash just to keep his daughter warm for one night. $2 million turned into ash and smoke just to raise the temperature a few degrees. To him, the money was nothing. It was just paper. His family was everything. But the circle was tightening. He was tired. He was sick. He was separated from his family because it was too dangerous for them to be with him. He was hiding in a middle-class house in Maydane, growing a beard, looking fat and weary. All he wanted to do was talk to his son. He knew the police were listening. Kay knew that if he stayed on the phone too long, they would trace the signal. But he missed his voice. He stayed on the line too long. Technicians in a van scanned the frequencies. They saw the spike, a teen. They triangulated the signal. They looked at a map and pointed to a house in a neighborhood called Los Olivos. He's there. Troops surrounded the building. They were quiet. They moved like ghosts. They burst through the heavy oak door. Pablo heard them. He grabbed his gun. He wasn't going to go in handcuffs. He ran to the window and climbed out onto the orange tile roof. He was barefoot. The man who owned airplanes and islands was running across a dirty rooftop in his socks. Gunshots rang out. Pop, pop, pop. It wasn't a movie scene with slow motion and dramatic music. It was chaotic. It was loud. It was dirty. Pablo fell. He lay there on the red tiles of the roof. The king of cocaine. The man who burned millions to stay warm. The man who held a country hostage. He was dead. The police officers smiled. They cheered. They took pictures posing next to his body like it was a hunting trophy. They lifted his shirt to show his belly. It was over. The monster was gone. But as the smoke cleared, the world was left to look at what happened. It was a story of magical realism, story that feels too crazy to be true, yet it was. It's a story about how much money one man can have and how little it matters in the end. Pablo Escobar had enough cash to buy a country. He had enough power to make presidents tremble. He had armies of men ready to die for him. But in his final moment, on that hot rooftop in Maydane, none of that helped him. The rubber bands couldn't hold his life together. The buried millions couldn't buy him another breath. He died alone, with nothing but a radio in his hand and a bullet in his head. He proved that you can be the richest man in the graveyard, but you are still in the graveyard. And that is the true legacy of the king of cocaine. A legacy of silver, a legacy of lead, and in the end, just a lonely silence on a tin roof.